Hi there, I'm Rebecca Willumson. I'm the publisher of Fierce Biotech, and I'm here today with Derk Arts, founder and CEO of Castor. Derk, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So Derk, to kick things off, can you provide some information on Castor and the company's overall mission?
Yeah, of course. Castor is a global platform for running clinical trials. These days, very often those are decentralized clinical trials. And we try to really change the way medical research is conducted. So not only thinking about how we make trials more patient-centric by providing solutions such as e-consent, remote enrollment, data capture through apps, for example, but also really thinking about how do we maximize the impact from data that comes out of those trials. So that means thinking about machine readability, fostering a future where federated learning can be used to make evidence-based medicine more efficient. So really having an holistic view on how do we make clinical trials more patient-centric and efficient, but how do we also make that knowledge dissemination process that comes after that much more efficient and much more data-driven, because I think that is often overlooked, and it's a very important part of our vision and mission.
Very good. So tell me, how is Castor using tech to democratize clinical research?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we were very deliberate when we started using that terminology because, as you may know, Castor has historically always made sure that our technology is available for non-profit entities, if you will. And I think that is a critical part of trying to change evidence-based medicine and medical research. If you create the Ferrari of all technology platforms that is only available to a small selection of trials that are funded by the biggest sponsors in the industry, the biggest pharmaceutical players, you're not actually going to change the way this world works. I'm a medical doctor myself. I have a PhD in medicine and medical informatics. So I've seen both sides. I know that the big drug trials are critically important to innovate and to develop new drugs and medical devices. But at the same time, it's often a very large body of investigator-led trials that are ensuring that investigators across the globe and physicians across the globe actually are picking up on those innovations and are actually starting to prescribe them and treat patients better. And so for me, democratizing clinical research means creating the best possible technology to run a modern version of a clinical trial, a patient-centered trial that incorporates data from many different sources to be as efficient and as least burdensome as possible. But also ensuring that that same technology can be used by anyone. So making it possible to self-serve, for example. So instead of paying a hefty service fee, you can also use Castor's technology without us, and you can do it yourself. We have our academy. We have ways that people can onboard and train them and certify themselves. And so for me, democratizing clinical research really means making sure that the technology that we create is accessible to anyone, and in a way that they can be independently conducting these trials, so that they can also change their part and not just the part where the big trials are playing out.
Very good. Now, after witnessing the last 19 months, how do you think clinical trials have changed, and do you think it's for the better?
I think this is a topic that's been discussed pretty extensively. The main thing that changed, of course, is the number of months that the pandemic started. A number of months ago, the pandemic started. But I do think the higher that number becomes, the bigger the difference. Because ultimately what we've seen is we saw some very immediate action because trials got stuck, and we saw some emergency regulation coming out of the FDA that allows us to do more with things like e-consent, for example. And then I think also we people became a little bit more comfortable with the pandemic. Of course, vaccines started to come out, and we saw this sort of movement of thinking where there's quite a few people thinking that maybe the more patient-centric approaches of creating more hybrid trials where we have half of the visits in a patient's home and half of the visits at a site, or even more extreme. I think people were thinking, well, maybe that's just going to revert and it's going to just change back. But I think what actually happened after that initial spike, we are definitely on a higher baseline right now. So a higher baseline for me means that if you look at all the trials that are being currently conducted, and you look at how we structured them, how we've designed them to an extent, or how we've adapted them, you'll definitely see more use of remote consenting, for example. You'll definitely see more use of capturing data remotely through apps, for example. You'll definitely see a lot more flexibility around the thinking of, does this have to happen in person, or can we do it through a televisit? So I don't think we see sort of a drastic, completely different landscape. That's not a realistic view, I think, on what we're seeing. But what is true is that there's just a much higher use of pieces of technology that make trials just a little bit more patient-friendly, or allow some of those visits to happen in patients' homes. And I think that's great. It's definitely for the better, because we all know how big the issue is of just traveling to a site. Just that small part of participating in a trial, the actual time it takes to get there, it's been talked about at length, but it makes a huge difference. It makes a huge difference in the burden. It makes a huge difference in enrollment rates, in retention rates. And so I think it's great, because it ultimately means we can conduct trials more efficiently. We can enroll more patients from a wider group, reduce bias, make trials more patient-friendly, increase retention, therefore they finish faster, therefore we get cures to patients who need them faster in the end. So yes, I absolutely think it's for the better, but I think we're still in a phase of everyone's trying to determine, can we really do this, and for what trials do we want to do it? And so it's going to be an interesting next few years, I think, to see how high that sort of baseline is going to get.
Okay. Now, as the industry continues to evolve, we're seeing more organizations rely on decentralized or hybrid modalities. So what evidence or benchmarks of operational success can you all share?
Yeah, I think it's something we as an industry need to still work on. It also relates to a topic we pre-discussed. What we see here at Castor is obviously a very sort of different mix of types of engagements we have with our customers and the questions they're asking. So it's very clear if you look at it now versus 24 months ago. 24 months ago, almost no one was asking about things like e-consent or decentralized or doing things remotely. Now almost every single customer at least has questions about it. Whether they will incorporate it in every single protocol, that is yet to be seen. But they want to be ready, right? There's definitely a sense in almost every engagement we do of how do we make sure that we can adapt to this new future. And so some come to us plainly saying, look, we want a platform for decentralized clinical trials. And some say, hey, we just look for a new CDMS, but we want to know sort of how could you deal with the reality of DCT. So that's a huge difference we just see here at Castor. And I think almost any other tech company in life sciences will see that. So those questions and just increase the preparedness and even the willingness to conduct those trials across our portfolio. But also, I think we see it in sort of the funding that goes into the market. And so you can definitely recognize that generally we see the industry moving in that direction. So it's a pretty weak proxy, but I think still relevant. And I think what we need to continue to do is measure success against the reference standard, which is very challenging. And so I do think there's plenty of data available online on how these types of trials can increase retention. But I do think we need to put more effort into building out that body of evidence that really shows that DCTs are the way to go. Or actually, we should stop talking about DCTs, right? Because this is also a point Craig Lipset makes quite often. It's at some point this has got to be normal, and at some point that means we don't give it a separate name anymore. But let's say we just want to prove that the new way of running clinical trials does indeed lead to higher patient satisfaction, lead to higher retention, lead to the same results in just a shorter time frame.
So as we look to the future, what steps can the industry take to help promote hybrid or decentralized trials? And what about within organizations?
Yeah, so to start within organizations, a model I really like that some of the bigger sponsors are playing with is having a process for trying out new technology, so new vendors, but then getting the study teams, who often ultimately have the final say in do I want this technology in my trial or not, actually incorporating them in a mock trial. So if you think of how do we create this momentum internally, I think it's a great idea to expose the decision makers. So not just the people who buy the technology or in procurement or who are in the innovation side of the business, but really also the study teams, right? So can we get those people into a simple mock trial where they kind of start to see the difference between what would this be traditionally and how would this work if I were a patient in a trial. So imagine you now have to drive for 2 hours just to go through a simple questionnaire versus just launching a televisit on your iPad. I think that can really help study teams to at least see the benefits, but also feel more comfortable, like, hey, this technology actually works. This is something that I as a patient would really appreciate. And of course, there's just the education internally also around what we can do easily. Those small steps, right? It doesn't have to be all out. Let's change every aspect of a protocol. What is the smallest incremental change we can make to move a little bit in this direction? Is it allowing some patients to consent remotely, or is it maybe just capturing one single ePro questionnaire through an app, for example? There can be small steps that just build that comfort. So I think that's number two. And number three is going back to my previous point. We all as the industry need to not just blindly jump into, well, let's do something innovative and we just run it. And then after the fact, we look back and think, well, yeah, I think that was successful, right? I mean, that was pretty good. What we want to be able to do is say, look, recruitment rates in this side of the trial versus this side of the trial were significantly higher because there we used modern technology, if you will, and here we use more traditional measures. So let's say we run a trial, we have traditional sites and we have one virtual site. Right? Something I see quite often where they just plug in one virtual site who pretends to be a real site. Now making sure we publish, right? So we capture the information on how quickly do we enroll, what is the patient retention, what is patient satisfaction, what is the data quality, what were some of the issues, and then actually coming out and publishing about that in a rigorous way. So really taking a scientific approach to how we conduct the trial. So it's basically a meta trial, if you will, running alongside your main project, just to make sure that we capture those metrics that ultimately would convince the rest of the industry that this is something that absolutely has to happen. Because if somehow we could produce a meta-analysis of, let's say, 50 studies that have all been studies of these sort of A/B test studies, that would send a very strong message. If consistently you see that those enroll faster, have higher patient satisfaction at basically very little cost in terms of data quality or cost of the study or outcomes, that would send a very strong message. But I don't think we're doing enough there. So I think we really need to look at each other and think about how do we, in a structured way, capture that information and report on it so that we increase the excitement about what we're trying to change here.
Very good. So my final question for you, what's on the horizon, or what are you anticipating in the clinical trial space, and what would you say is the next decentralized frontier being tackled or that needs to be tackled?
So what's on the horizon, I think immediately, is just getting a lot more comfortable with this technology, doing some of the things we just spoke about, and slowly seeing the more conservative study teams trying to incorporate some of these elements. But you can also see that you have Best Buy buying a company like Current Health. You have CVS obviously going into decentralized trials in a very visible way. You have Facebook putting their research teams together. There's a lot of interesting things happening, and I think that a very important change that we're going to see is where we try to start to mesh all these changes. So if you really think deeply, what does a trial look like in 2035? I think it's going to be much easier to participate. There's going to be a lot more standardization, so it's much easier to have data from various sources be incorporated into a clinical trial. Because if you think about it, right, so ideally we have sort of three levels of decentralization. We have the actual site for example, an MRI, and then we have maybe a blood draw that can happen at a CVS or a Walgreens or in the Best Buy, potentially, who knows, or just in your local supermarket or at home, right? So we have the brick and mortar infrastructure that's all around us and very close to us. We have our home and we have the sites. So I think what we're going to start to see is when these things start to mesh together. So we use these components to do remote consenting. We then offer optionality. So you can actually opt into, I would like someone to come to my home, or I'll do this visit remotely, or no, actually I like in-person communication. I don't want to be in my home all the time. I'm here all the time anyway, so I want to go to my local CVS, or I actually don't mind going to the hospital and ideally seeing my own physician, right? So that's another one that comes in. How do we bring your own physician into the mix here? So I think what we need to be seeing, and hopefully what we'll be seeing, is that everyone's launching their own big initiative and making a lot of fanfare out how they are going to change the way we run clinical trials. What actually I think we need to be seeing is, how do we make these things come together? How do we get what Google is doing to complement what CBS is doing, to complement what Castor is doing, and to create a new type of trial that just really reduces burden but increases output and reusability of the information that comes out of that trial. There's so many exciting initiatives going on, and I think it's really up to the visionaries to find that model where you bring those together and you really start to see a difference that matters, because I think that's often lacking. Making a difference is doing things differently is quite easy, but actually doing it in a way that it makes it different, that it has an impact on parameters that we care about, that is surprisingly hard. So I hope that is going to be on the horizon. It's definitely a frontier that I want to be tackling in the next 5 years.
Well, that feels like a great place to close out. Derk, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.